It's a pleasure to welcome back to the show Dr. Zuhdi Jasser. Zuhdi's a U.S. Navy veteran, an American patriot, and a devout Muslim. Welcome back to the show, Zuhdi.
Oh, Denny, it's always great to be with you. Thanks for having me.
Zuhdi, begin by giving us a quick review of your naval service. You served for quite a few years as a medical doctor, as I recollect.
Yeah, I grew up in Wisconsin and was on a naval scholarship through the Medical College of Wisconsin, and then I served 11 years as a medical officer. Did my training at Bethesda Naval Hospital, was on the USS El Paso, participated in Operation Restore Hope in Somalia, and then was chief of residence at Bethesda. And my last tour was as a physician to Congress at the attending physician's office, which is a naval medical clinic that takes care of the Supreme Court justices and the congressional members.
And indeed, there is no question in my mind throughout our years of knowing each other that you are one, a proud veteran, two, a proud American, and two, a proud Muslim. Is that a right combination?
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think that as important as that is to me, I think that that narrative is important to all of our work, because at the end of the day, what radicalizes Muslims that end up going south towards radical Islam is the fact that they want to die for the cause of jihad. And I grew up in a family that taught me that the only thing you'd ever want to die for is America, and everything else is between an individual and God. And ultimately, that's why I ended up serving in the military.
So you were raised in a Muslim family, and you were not raised to believe that you were supposed to die for Islam. You were supposed to be a good citizen. Is that right?
Absolutely. I was raised to believe that while jihad had a role in history, that this is a concept that we need to reform, and that by living in America, we have reformed it, that jihad is no longer and should never be part of the state mandate of a citizen to its state, and that's only a mandate if it's an Islamic state, and that the time of the Islamic state is gone, no different than America went through its revolution against Christian theocracy. Islam needs to go through its revolutions against Islamic theocracy, and that the death of the concept of jihad needs to happen along with the death of the Islamic State, and that the only way to do that is to believe that the only thing you would ever want to protect and die for is the U.S. Constitution and its freedoms and liberty guaranteed by our government. And the two are not compatible, meaning that you can't believe that a Muslim majority or even minority can live in a jihadist state and also believe in the U.S. Constitution. Those two things are incompatible. But being Muslim and being American are not incompatible. Believing in Islam, at least the version of Islam that I learned from my grandparents who were Syrian and experts in Sharia, and their reformed concepts of that, is very compatible. But certainly the Islam of Iran, the Islam of Saudi Arabia and their governments, the Muslim Brotherhood, Hamas, all these radical groups that are large movements, that's incompatible with the American Islam that I learned from my parents.
And you were not alone. You were not unique. You weren't isolated in your Islamic community in Wisconsin because you believed that. Everybody you know believed that?
Yeah, I mean, that's the community that my parents hung around, and the Muslims that I became close to. We built the first mosque in northern Wisconsin. Actually, I just went there back to Neenah, Wisconsin in October, and they had a Hall of Fame for individuals that have become prominent from that small high school. And it was just fascinating to see that small mosque, small community still there, and they still never take any foreign funding. And we talked to them about our Muslim Reform Movement declaration. And, I think there's a lot of smaller communities around the country like that. Unfortunately, they've not made their voices heard. They've not pushed back against the establishment of our religion, which is the big problem, which is the global establishment of Islamic leadership that have been not only denying reform, but they are the primary problem.
And it is true, I believe, that in some of these Islamic states in the Mideast, there are beheadings and killings and that kind of thing going on with some degree of frequency, that's not uncommon.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there were more beheadings in Saudi Arabia in the last 6 months than ISIS did. The only difference between the Saudi government and ISIS is the Saudis are an organized modern military with a so-called judiciary that pretends to be about the rule of law, but their law is Wahhabi law, their law is one in which Christians can't practice publicly. They can't build churches. Any minority voices within Islam are killed, beheaded, called apostates if you disagree with the government. People like Raif Badawi and his lawyer Walid Abu Khair are flogged in front of mosques publicly. So to say that ISIS are barbarians is true, but to say that they sort of come out of thin air as aberrations is deception. They are a natural byproduct of the type of Islam practice in Saudi Arabia. And then you go to Iran, the Shiite version of that, and the Shia Islamists are no different. They persecute women, prevent them from having any freedoms of agency or bodily autonomy. Gays are killed. Apostates are also convicted and beheaded. So Iran is no different. It's like the Pepsi and Coca-Cola versions of political Islam. They're both theocracies.
This is Colonel Denny Gillem on Frontlines of Freedom. We're discussing Islam and Muslims in America with Dr. Zuhdi Jasser. Zuhdi, one of the things that I wanted to talk about is the challenge that our country's going through right now. The president has ordered restrictions on immigration. Some of the courts are arguing with him. From the basis of what you've been talking about, there is truly a threat to America if some forms of Islam are allowed into America, and particularly from the countries that you're talking about. Did I understand that correctly?
Well, I'd be careful from an immigration perspective. It's not about their religion. It's about the political ideas that are incompatible with America. Now, those political ideas are theocratic. They're Islamist. And I think the problem that President Trump had with the court system is probably most of it's coming from his lack of nuance and his problem with verbiage during the campaign, where he clearly said Muslim ban many times, where he clearly said things like Islam hates us and didn't separate Islamism as a political theocratic ideology from the faith itself. But having said that, these 7 countries were 7 countries listed by the Obama administration as hot terror spots with governments that are unreliable. I mean, if you look at Yemen, Libya, Iraq, Syria, these are anarchies for the most part, with governments that are non-reliable and large terror groups that are operating wholesale in society there that make them a good place to start. But to say that it's a Muslim ban when they're simply limiting and listing countries, President Obama had a pause on immigration for 6 months from Iraq, and nobody called it, but he did it quiet and didn't make it publicly something that was talked about. Even Carter did the same thing with Iran. So, nations being cut off for a short period of time is not about religion. I will tell you that I don't understand why Syria was put on the indefinite list. I think that if you're going to pause in order to recalibrate how we're vetting refugees, that pause should include Syria, which is the country that probably needs the most humanitarian support for its refugees. So I think it's very American to do extreme vetting against political Islam and Islamism, but I think it's also very American once we vet them to bring in refugees and have America mean something, which is a place for those seeking freedom and liberty who share our values.
And that's the bottom line, isn't it? Should we not, as a general statement, when we're accepting immigrants, refugees, whatever, look for people who want to come here to be Americans with whatever faith than people who want to come here to change us? Doesn't that make sense?
Exactly. And this is where we should be unapologetic about it, and the courts should back our commander-in-chief up when he presents a plan for security and embodying what America stands for. So I think the question is all in messaging and execution and how we do this. At the end of the day, we don't, if there are movements that seek to undermine and destroy our way of life, I don't believe that those folks have the same rights as our citizens. It's a privilege to come to the United States, and part of that privilege is gained upon not only proving that you're politically or religiously persecuted, but also proving that you share the ideals of what America's about. Because if you don't, then why don't they go to Saudi Arabia or to Iran or other countries that are tyrannies, which are taking no refugees? But ultimately, if you believe in some type of tyrannical government, I don't want them here. And by the way, it's not just about Islamists. I would hope those who believe in the Russian form of government, which is a tyrannical kleptocracy of Putin, I would hope that Chinese communists are not welcome here. So anyone who believes in a form of tyranny should be filtered in our vetting of immigrants, that they should welcome our ideas.
I quite agree. And there's a lot more to cover on Muslims in America, and Dr. Jasser will stay with us. This is Colonel Denny Gillem on Frontlines of Freedom. Troops, hit the deck, do an easy, slow 50 push-ups with your partner sitting on your back. I want to see those biceps and triceps. We'll be right back. This is Colonel Denny Gillem. I want to share about an incredible program available for our veterans across America who are suffering from PTS and traumatic brain injury. It's called After the Impact, and it serves our veterans and NFL football players. You know, it all started at the Eisenhower Center in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and is now expanded to a new facility in Jacksonville, Florida. After the Impact provides real treatment and healing in a transitional residential setting. See more about their facilities for veterans and players at EisenhowerCenter.com.
If you served honorably in our nation's armed forces and you're looking for a way to continue serving your fellow veterans in your community, then join AMVETS. Each year, AMVETS members volunteer millions of hours at VA healthcare facilities from coast to coast. AMVETS posts and departments also participate in a wide variety of community service projects ranging from Americanism in our schools to supporting the Special Olympics and Boy Scouts of America. If you no longer wear the uniform today, you can still serve through the AMVETS by joining today at amvets.org.
I'm Colonel Denny Gillem. Thanks for joining us today on Frontlines of Freedom. AMVETS is the premier veteran service organization in America. Every person who has served honorably in our military, active guard or reserve, can join. Go to amvets.org. We're continuing our discussion of Muslims in America with U.S. Navy veteran and medical doctor Zuhdi Jasser. Zuhdi, I read a lot about Muslim immigrants in Europe raping, rioting, and generally causing serious problems for the nations that welcomed them. There must be at least some truth to that. Is that an issue?
Well, there's no doubt that some of the refugees and those pretending or who are refugees that went into Europe were committing acts of crime and just heinous behavior seen in Sweden and Finland and Germany and elsewhere. Crime seen around New Year's earlier last year and this year. And, you know, obviously the rates of those crimes, I believe, are higher than you'd see in a normal population. But having said that, we have to be careful not to then make that a way to characterize refugees who, for the most part, are just escaping a genocide from both the Assad regime and ISIS, who is just it's the greatest humanitarian disaster in humanity since World War II. And, you know, these, for the most part, are victims and are folks that, remember, Syria has been living under this tyranny and dictatorship for almost 2 generations now, since 1963. So the pummeling of that community and the moral degradation that's happened since my family left in 66 has just created a massive deficit of not only rights, but morality. So that's why when you vet people, it needs to be vetted not only for ideology, but for criminality and other things. And this is what happens when you accept too many, like a sonic boom. You're going to get a disproportionate amount of criminals.
Boy, that makes very good sense. You made a point a little earlier when you said that basically the neighbors around Syria, Saudi Arabia, others, are not taking any refugees. They're co-religionists, theoretically, and neighbors. Why do you think they are not taking any of these refugees? Wouldn't it be better for refugees to be local and all that?
Well, yeah, I mean, we keep applying questions. Your question is the question from somebody from a free society who believes that we have a role either religiously or as Americans to take care of the world, to give back the blessings that we have in this country. Those fascists in Saudi Arabia and Iran believe that God gave them the right to own the Grand Mosque and that they are the custodians of Islam and they must keep it clean of everybody. I mean, these are communities that refer to the African American, the black community, as in a term that's very racist. So they are very fascistic, racist societies that are not open, that are medieval in their implementation, not only domestically, but their approach to the region. We've not held them accountable to those values. for those lack of values. And unfortunately, because of the oil and other things, we've pretended to be their allies when, in fact, they really share none of that. And their humanitarian aid that they do is more about sending billions abroad. And it's not really to help people. They send billions abroad to spread their Wahhabi ideology. So when they talked about sending money to Germany to help Muslims, they said the Saudis said they were going to build mosques with that. Well, those people don't need mosques. They need food and clothing and shelter. And they would have done much better to bring them into their societies. But also, I will tell you, aside from the criminals that we talked about earlier, the majority of those folks don't want to go to Saudi Arabia because they know they left one tyranny not to go to another one. And that's one of the problems we have in being the free countries of the West that we are, is that many people want to come here because the other countries are not very attractive.
This is Colonel Denny Gillem on Frontlines of Freedom, and we're discussing Muslims in America with Dr. Zuhdi Jasser. Zuhdi, we've got several minutes left. I'd like you to take some time now and talk about the American Islamic Forum for Democracy. Who are you? What do you do? How do you do it? Who can plug in? How are you funded? Give us AIFD 101.
Yeah, our American Islamic Forum is at aifdemocracy.org, AIF as in forum, democracy.org. I'd ask people to go there. There's an interactive website that engages you on various platforms that we use. And basically, we have two major programs. One is the Muslim Reform Movement, and the other is our public engagement project that includes media and speaking opportunities and debating opportunities to really engage other Muslims and engage the American community on what our strategy should be culturally and politically, which is to counter political Islam, and that Americans should take a side within the House of Islam. This is not a war against Islam, but rather a battle, as my book is called, a battle for the soul of Islam, that a battle within the House of Islam. And I would say it's very American to take the side of the anti-theocrats and those who believe in liberty. And that we ask Americans to take the side of those who believe in freedom against the theocrats, which are the Islamists, like the Muslim Brotherhood and others. I also have a website called Take Back Islam, takebackislam.com, which has a newsletter. It's an insider newsletter that we're going to begin sending out in the next few weeks to people who want to sign on and become part of the newsletter readership about where I am on the front lines of this battle, as you know. And lastly, our Muslim Reform Movement at muslimreformmovement.org is a coalition of very diverse liberal and conservative organizations that have this two-page declaration that we'd ask people to distribute, engage in a conversation. It's basically 12 principles of what we believe is a way to define if Muslims believe in those 12 principles, they're our allies. If they don't, if they won't reject the caliphate, if they won't reject jihad, then we would ask that they not be considered our allies and be considered our either debating foes or militants, if you will, if they won't condemn violence, etc. But this isn't a military problem. It's an ideological one. And on all these fronts, we're trying to engage the long-term solution rather than the short-term whack-a-mole program that Homeland Security and other things so far have been.
Well, solving the challenges you've just described truly is a problem for Islam to handle internally. You don't need a lot of non-Muslims trying to solve problems for you. We need to be supportive of you while you work out your own issues. Isn't that true?
Yeah, but remember, the West has the greatest megaphone on the planet. Global culture is driven by if you look at the social media technologies of Facebook, Google, YouTube, Twitter. These technologies are Western. They're American. And they have shifted and changed huge populations with revolutions. So don't underestimate. Yes, the primary ideological antagonists are going to be Muslim, and that's what our Muslim Reform Movement has. But as long as the West doesn't take the side of the leaders in our reform movement, the Wahhabis and the Saudis are spending billions on their information operation. Let me give you one quick example. There was a little deli in New Mexico that had on the storefront, it said, "No Muslims allowed." And it was a little hole in the wall. Nobody would have ever heard anything about it. A bunch of, fascists or whatever they are. But the Council on American Islamic Relations, part of the global Islamic propaganda machine, took a picture of that thing. And next thing you know, it's on the front of Saudi media, Iranian media, globally. They're on the headlines of their Al Arabiya newspaper saying that this is the perception in America of Muslims. So they're radicalizing the world Muslim community, taking a deceptive picture of some hole in the wall to say that this is what America believes. And meanwhile, the opposite, the counter-ops of that, rather than simply refuting that, to have American Muslims saying we want reform that is focused on liberty and freedom and promoting our concepts of Americanism, which is the best place to practice our faith on the planet, that type of ideology is not being spread or being invested in by America in any of the platforms that exist. Instead, we Muslims are being used sort of as a pawn between the left and the right in partisan politics week to week here domestically.
Zuhdi, that's a great summary, and that's a great call to action for all of our listeners. We need to be supportive, publicly supportive, of AIFD and other groups like that want Muslims to be good people of faith and great Americans, and support them and help publicize that so that it has a chance to happen. Zuhdi, thank you for taking time to join us today. Thank you for your service to our nation back in uniform, but especially now. I really appreciate you, my friend.
Anytime. God bless. Appreciate it, Denny.